Las Vegas, Nevada, June 12, 1960. The Sands Hotel and Casino on the Las Vegas Strip was the crown jewel of American entertainment, where Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack performed to sold-out crowds every night, where million-dollar gambling operations generated more cash than most legitimate businesses, where Hollywood stars and politicians and mobsters mixed freely in an atmosphere of glamour and excess that defined 1960s Las Vegas. On this particular Saturday night, the Copa Room showroom at the Sands was packed with over 500 patrons who'd paid premium prices to see one of the most talented entertainers in America. A Negro singer and dancer named Jonathan "Johnny Silk" Williams, who'd been performing in Las Vegas for 3 years, who'd built a reputation as someone whose talent rivaled Sammy Davis Jr., whose shows were so spectacular that even the most racist white audiences had to admit he was extraordinary. If you're watching this story about the insult that destroyed a mob empire in 72 hours, drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from, and subscribe so you never miss the dark stories that shaped American entertainment and organized crime. Johnny Silk Williams was 34 years old in June 1960, born in New Orleans in 1926, raised in a family of musicians, trained in jazz clubs where Negro performers weren't allowed to sit in the audience, but could perform on stage for white patrons. Williams had come to Las Vegas in 1957, had worked his way up from small lounges to main showrooms, had proven himself talented enough that casino owners couldn't ignore him despite the racial segregation that dominated Las Vegas in the late 1950s. By 1960, Williams was headlining at the Sands, was earning $5,000 per week, was living proof that exceptional talent could sometimes overcome racial barriers, even in a city where Negro performers were required to enter through back doors and weren't allowed to stay in the hotels where they performed. But on this Saturday night, June 12, 1960, Johnny Silk Williams made a mistake that would change his life and would trigger a series of events that would reshape Las Vegas power dynamics. During his performance, during a moment when he was interacting with the audience between songs, Williams made a joke. A lighthearted comment about how Las Vegas hotels treated Negro performers differently than white performers, how colored entertainers could perform on stage but couldn't gamble in the casino, or swim in the pool, or stay in the rooms. The joke wasn't angry or bitter. It was observational, delivered with Williams' characteristic charm, the kind of social commentary that Negro performers often used to address uncomfortable truths while keeping white audiences entertained rather than offended. The audience laughed. Most of them understood Williams was pointing out an obvious injustice, but doing so in a way that didn't make them feel attacked or guilty. It was the kind of performance skill that made Williams successful, his ability to navigate racial dynamics without alienating the white audiences who paid to see him perform. But sitting at a front-row table was Sam Giancana, 52 years old, boss of the Chicago outfit, one of the most powerful organized crime families in America, a man who controlled gambling operations in Chicago and had significant influence over Las Vegas casinos through hidden ownership stakes and through relationships with other mobsters who ran the Strip's major hotels. Giancana was in Las Vegas on business, meeting with other mob bosses to discuss territorial arrangements and profit sharing from casino operations. He'd come to the Sands that evening because the casino was partially controlled by Chicago interests, because watching the show was part of maintaining relationships with casino management, because being seen at the right places was important for someone in Giancana's position. Giancana had been drinking heavily throughout the evening, expensive scotch, glass after glass, enough that his judgment was impaired, and his already minimal impulse control was completely gone. When Johnny Silk Williams made his joke about how Las Vegas treated Negro performers, when the audience laughed, Giancana stood up from his front-row table. The showroom went quiet. 500 people stopped laughing, stopped talking, turned to look at what was happening. Because Sam Giancana standing up during a performance meant something was about to happen. Something dramatic. Giancana pointed at Williams on stage. "You think that's funny? You think you can stand up there and complain about how we treat you people? Let me tell you something, boy. You're lucky we let you perform at all. You're lucky we don't make you shine shoes or clean toilets like most N-words do. You should be grateful you get to entertain white people instead of picking cotton like your ancestors did." The showroom went completely silent. The kind of silence where 500 people collectively held their breath, shocked by what they were witnessing. Sam Giancana, one of the most powerful mobsters in America, had just called a performer the N-word in a packed Las Vegas showroom in front of hundreds of witnesses, including journalists, celebrities, and other mob figures who understood that what Giancana was doing violated unwritten rules about how public racism was supposed to be managed in Las Vegas. Johnny Silk Williams stood on stage, frozen, his face showing a mixture of shock and humiliation and rage that he couldn't express, because responding aggressively to a white mob boss would likely get him killed. The band had stopped playing. The showroom staff stood motionless. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. Giancana wasn't finished. He walked toward the stage, still pointing at Williams. "You don't like how we treat you? Then get out. Go back to whatever ghetto you came from. We don't need uppity N-words who think they're too good to be grateful for the opportunities we give them. You're nothing without us. You're nothing without white audiences paying to see you. Don't forget that." Then Giancana turned to address the entire showroom. "This is what's wrong with these people. You give them a chance, you let them make money performing for civilized audiences, and they complain instead of being grateful. Well, I'm done with this." He turned back to Williams. "Your show is over. Get off the stage. You're fired. And you'll never work in Las Vegas again. I'll make sure every casino on the Strip knows what an ungrateful troublemaker you are." Giancana walked back to his table, sat down, and ordered another drink, as if nothing unusual had happened. Johnny Silk Williams stood on stage for another moment, then quietly set down his microphone and walked off stage through the backstage exit. The audience sat in stunned silence. The showroom manager eventually announced that the evening's performance was concluded and thanked patrons for attending. 500 people filed out of the Copa room in near silence, processing what they'd just witnessed. Sam Giancana went to bed that night, believing he'd put an uppity Negro performer in his place, believing he'd demonstrated his power, believing there would be no consequences, because who was going to challenge one of the most powerful mob bosses in America over how he treated a colored entertainer? But Giancana had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Because what happened in that showroom on June 12, 1960, didn't stay private. It was witnessed by journalists who wrote about it, by celebrities who spread the story throughout Hollywood, by other mobsters who understood that Giancana had created a public relations disaster, and most importantly, by people who had the power to make Giancana pay a price that would cost him far more than he'd ever imagined. This is where Sam Giancana's empire starts to crumble. If you're still watching, comment below what city you're from and hit subscribe, because what happens over the next 72 hours will shock you. Within 12 hours of the incident, the story was everywhere. The Los Angeles Times ran a front-page article titled, "Mob Boss's Racist Tirade Shocks Las Vegas." The New York Times covered it. Jet magazine, which served Negro readership, ran a detailed account with quotes from witnesses. Radio stations discussed it. Television news programs mentioned it. By Sunday afternoon, June 13th, everyone in America who paid attention to news or entertainment knew that Sam Giancana had called Johnny Silk Williams the N-word in a Las Vegas showroom and had fired him for making a mild joke about racial segregation. The immediate response was outrage. Civil rights organizations issued statements condemning Giancana and calling for boycotts of any Las Vegas casino he was associated with. Negro entertainers, many of whom had experienced similar racism but had remained silent out of fear of losing work, now spoke publicly about how they'd been treated in Las Vegas. Frank Sinatra, who'd been a friend of Giancana but who also worked frequently with Negro performers and who understood that Giancana's behavior was indefensible, issued a statement saying he was appalled by what had happened and that racism had no place in American entertainment. But the real damage came from three sources that Giancana hadn't anticipated. First, the federal government. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who'd been looking for opportunities to damage organized crime's public image, immediately ordered increased surveillance of Giancana and his Chicago outfit operations. Hoover understood that Giancana's racist outburst had created public sympathy for federal action against the mob, had made it easier to justify aggressive prosecution of organized crime figures who could now be portrayed not just as criminals, but as racists who represented everything wrong with America. Second, Las Vegas casino owners. The men who actually ran the Strip's major hotels understood that Giancana's behavior threatened their businesses. Las Vegas in 1960 was trying to present itself as a glamorous, sophisticated destination, not as a racist backwater. Negro entertainers were essential to Las Vegas's appeal. Performers like Sammy Davis Jr., Nat King Cole, Ella Fitzgerald drew audiences that spent money in casinos. If Las Vegas became known as a place where Negro performers were publicly humiliated, those performers would refuse to work there, and Las Vegas would lose a significant attraction. Casino owners met privately on Sunday, June 13th, and reached a consensus. Sam Giancana had to be distanced from Las Vegas operations. His continued visible presence was a liability they couldn't afford. Third, and most devastatingly, other mobsters. Organized crime families from New York, from Detroit, from other cities who had interests in Las Vegas understood that Giancana had created exactly the kind of public attention that was dangerous for illegal operations. The whole point of Las Vegas was to operate casinos that generated enormous profits while maintaining a veneer of legitimacy that allowed them to function without constant law enforcement interference. Giancana's racist tirade had torn away that veneer, had focused media attention on mob control of Las Vegas casinos, had given federal authorities justification to increase investigations. Other mob bosses were furious, not because they disapproved of Giancana's racism, many of them held similar views, but because he'd been stupid enough to express those views publicly in a way that damaged everyone's interests. By Monday, June 14th, 48 hours after the incident, Sam Giancana was receiving messages from multiple sources. FBI agents showed up at his Chicago home, served him with subpoenas, made clear that he was now a priority target for federal prosecution. Las Vegas casino owners who'd previously welcomed his involvement were now returning his phone calls with cold professionalism that indicated relationships had changed. And most ominously, representatives from other crime families suggested that Giancana should reduce his Las Vegas presence, should step back from public-facing roles, should recognize that his behavior had made him a liability. The financial impact was immediate and severe. Giancana had owned hidden stakes in 3 Las Vegas casinos. By Tuesday, June 15th, 72 hours after the incident, casino owners who managed those properties informed him that his ownership percentage was being bought out, not through negotiation, but through forced sale at valuations significantly below market rates. Giancana could either accept the buyout or face exposure of his illegal ownership stakes to federal authorities who were actively investigating him. He accepted the buyout, lost approximately $8 million in value, roughly $75 million in today's money, in forced sales that happened because casino owners couldn't afford to be associated with him after his public racism. But the damage extended beyond financial losses. Giancana's reputation within organized crime circles was permanently damaged. He demonstrated poor judgment, had prioritized ego over business interests, had created problems that affected everyone's operations. Within organized crime, reputation for being smart and controlled was essential. Giancana had shown he was neither. Over the following months, his influence within the Chicago outfit declined. Younger mobsters questioned his leadership. Other crime families reduced their cooperation with Chicago operations. By 1965, Giancana would be effectively forced into exile in Mexico, pushed out by a combination of federal pressure and internal mob politics that both stemmed partly from the perception that he was a liability who couldn't control himself. And Johnny Silk Williams? The immediate aftermath was devastating. As Giancana had threatened, Williams was blacklisted from Las Vegas casinos. No major hotel would hire him for months because casino owners feared angering mob figures, even though those same mob figures were distancing themselves from Giancana. Williams returned to smaller clubs, struggled financially, faced the reality that speaking truth about racism, even mildly, even humorously, could destroy a Negro performer's career. But then something unexpected happened. The national attention from the incident made Williams a symbol. Civil rights organizations embraced him. Negro newspapers wrote about him. Within 3 months, Williams was performing in venues outside Las Vegas, in cities where his story had made him famous, where audiences specifically came to see the performer who'd been called the N-word by a mob boss and who'd maintained his dignity. By late 1960, Williams was earning more than he'd ever made in Las Vegas, performing for integrated audiences who saw him as representing something important about dignity and resistance. And in 1961, when Las Vegas casinos finally began genuinely desegregating, not just allowing Negro performers, but allowing them to stay in hotels and use facilities, Johnny Silk Williams was invited back to headline at the Sands, the same showroom where he'd been humiliated. He performed to a standing ovation. And during that performance, he made another joke. He said, "Last time I was here, someone didn't like my sense of humor. But I notice he's not here tonight. I wonder where he went." The audience laughed, because everyone knew. Sam Giancana's Las Vegas empire was gone. Before we finish this story, if you made it this far, drop a comment telling us what country you're watching from. And subscribe because the hidden history of Las Vegas and organized crime has stories darker than the movies show you. The incident at the Sands on June 12, 1960, demonstrated several truths about power in America during the Civil Rights era. First, that public racism, even from powerful figures, was becoming costly in ways that it hadn't been in previous decades. The media attention, the public outrage, the economic consequences that Giancana faced would have been unthinkable in the 1930s or 1940s. But by 1960, American society was changing. The civil rights movement had created a context where racist behavior triggered genuine consequences, even for people as powerful as major mob bosses. Second, that organized crime's power depended on maintaining certain appearances. The mob could operate illegal casinos, could engage in corruption, could commit violence, as long as those activities remained somewhat hidden or could be justified as victimless or as problems between criminals. But public racism, especially the kind of blatant hatred that Giancana displayed, threatened the veneer of respectability that allowed Las Vegas to function. It focused attention on mob control of casinos in ways that made federal prosecution easier to justify. It alienated customers and performers who were essential to casino profitability. It turned mob figures into villains in a broader social struggle, rather than just criminals running illegal operations. Third, that even within organized crime, there were limits to acceptable behavior. Not moral limits, but practical limits based on what served criminal enterprises' interests. Giancana's racism itself wasn't the problem for other mobsters. The problem was expressing that racism in ways that damaged business. Other mob bosses forced Giancana out, not because they disagreed with his views, but because his inability to control those views made him a liability. In the cold calculus of organized crime, being racist was fine. Being publicly racist in ways that cost money was unforgivable. Sam Giancana died in 1975, murdered in his Chicago home, shot execution-style by unknown killers, likely connected to mob politics or to federal investigations he was cooperating with. When journalists wrote about his death, when they summarized his criminal career, many mentioned the 1960 Las Vegas incident. The night he called Johnny Silk Williams the N-word. The night he lost Las Vegas. The moment when his empire began to crumble. Not because of federal prosecution or because of rival gangsters, but because he'd been stupid enough to let his racism show in public. And Johnny Silk Williams performed in Las Vegas for another 20 years, became one of the most respected entertainers in the city, lived to see Las Vegas transform from a segregated city where Negro performers entered through back doors to a place where they could headline shows and stay in suites and be treated with the dignity they'd always deserved. Williams died in 1989, and his obituary in the Las Vegas Review-Journal mentioned that night in 1960, the night a mob boss called him the N-word and tried to end his career, the night that ended differently than anyone expected, the night Johnny Silk Williams discovered that sometimes dignity and talent matter more than power and hate, especially when the whole world is watching.